It was the middle of the 14th century, and across much of Europe life moved with a steady rhythm that had persisted for generations. The world was quieter then, not because there was no noise, but because sounds carried differently through a landscape untouched by engines or modern machinery. The clop of hooves on cobblestones could be heard far down a street before the rider appeared. A blacksmith's hammer striking iron would echo along narrow alleys and fade into the distance. The call of a market seller, offering bread or apples or salted fish, was not lost in the din of traffic, but stood alone in the air, distinct and clear. In the towns, houses leaned toward each other across cramped streets, their upper floors jutting out so far that neighbors could almost pass a loaf of bread from one window to another. These timber-framed buildings, with walls of wattle and daub, had weathered years of rain, frost, and wind. The roofs, mostly thatched with straw or reeds, darkened over time and sometimes sprouted moss in damp seasons. Beneath them, people lived in spaces lit by small windows, often shuttered to keep out the cold. The mornings began early. Long before the sun rose fully, bakers were at work, shaping loaves and sliding them into the heat of the oven. The smell of baking bread drifted out into the streets, mixing with the sharper scent of wood smoke from hearths being rekindled. Farmers arrived at the markets before many townspeople had even stirred from their beds. They led carts piled with cabbages, onions, carrots, and sacks of grain. Sometimes there were chickens in wicker cages, their feathers ruffled from the journey, or pigs with rope harnesses, grunting and pulling against their handlers. The market was the center of town life. It was not only where goods were exchanged but where news was traded as well. A traveler from another region might speak of the weather in his homeland, of whether the harvest had been good or bad, or of a fair to be held in a neighboring city. A merchant might boast of the fine cloth just arrived from distant lands, dyed in colors richer than anything the local weaver could produce. In the background, the church bells rang at regular intervals, marking the hours for prayer, work, and meals. Their sound was constant and familiar, like the heartbeat of the town. Most people lived close to their work. A shoemaker's workshop might be just a few steps from his front door. A cooper, making barrels, would hammer and shave wood in the open air just outside his home. Children played nearby, though their games were often simple, rolling hoops, tossing pebbles, or chasing each other in circles. Life was not without hardship. Illness was a part of existence, and few families reached old age without losing someone to fever or accident. Winters were cold and sometimes hungry, summers could bring drought or flooding. Yet the pace of life had a stability to it, a sense that one season would always follow another. In the countryside, fields stretched out in long strips, often divided among the families of a village. Men and women worked side by side, tending wheat, barley, and rye. They used simple tools, wooden-handled sickles, iron-tipped plows pulled by oxen, to till the soil and bring in the harvest. Hedges and low stone walls marked the edges of these fields, and beyond them lay meadows where sheep grazed. The sheep were valued not just for their meat, but for their wool, which was spun into thread and woven into cloth. Rural villages were smaller and quieter than towns, but they had their own rhythms. The ringing of a bell might signal the start of a festival or call the villagers together for important news. In the evenings, smoke rose from the chimneys of cottages, each with its own small garden for herbs and vegetables. Families gathered around the fire, sharing bread, cheese, or pottage, a simple stew made from whatever was available. By the light of the hearth, repairs were made to tools and clothing. Travel was slow. A journey of 20 miles might take most of a day on foot. Even on horseback, poor roads and rough weather could turn a short trip into a long one. For most people, the world was small. The village, the fields, the nearest market town. Only merchants, messengers, soldiers, and the occasional pilgrims saw much beyond their own region. News from afar arrived sporadically, carried by travelers who might embellish or misremember details. But even so, people were curious about the wider world, and a stranger's story was often welcomed with interest. This was the Europe that existed on the eve of great change. It was a world where life was shaped by the turning of the seasons, by the ringing of church bells, by the rising and setting of the sun. It was a world that felt, to those who lived in it, as though it had always been this way and always would be. The idea that an unseen threat could cross mountains and seas, touching every village and town, was far from most people's thoughts. Their concerns were rooted in the familiar, whether the weather would be kind, whether the crops would be plentiful, whether there would be enough firewood to last the winter. In the months to come, that sense of certainty would be tested in ways few could imagine. But for now, the days passed as they had for centuries, with work, with small joys, with the shared understanding that life was both fragile and enduring. The wind still carried the scent of bread and wood smoke. The streets still echoed with the clop of hooves and the laughter of children. And in the minds of most, tomorrow would be much the same as today. It began quietly, as most great changes do, not with a sudden cry or a visible shift, but with murmurs carried along the edges of familiar life. In the markets, where the air smelled of fresh bread, wool, and damp earth, people began to speak in low tones about strange events in far-off lands. A merchant from the east might mention a port where the docks had fallen silent, or a caravan that had turned back after hearing rumors of sickness in the towns ahead. The stories were scattered and often uncertain, told by travelers who themselves had heard them second or third hand. Some of these travelers spoke of cities where entire neighborhoods stood empty. Others described ships arriving with their sails furled, drifting into harbor without a guiding hand at the tiller. When dockworkers climbed aboard, they found only silence and the still forms of the crew, some lying as though asleep, others already shrouded in the smell of decay. Such tales were unsettling, but many dismissed them. Sickness was nothing new. Colds, fevers, and outbreaks of various illnesses passed through towns every few years. Most believed that whatever had struck those distant places would burn itself out before reaching their own. Yet the stories did not fade. In fact, they began to arrive more often. Traders from the Mediterranean brought news of a strange affliction spreading inland from the ports, a sickness that seemed to move faster than anyone expected. Some said it began with a sudden chill, followed by heat so intense that even the strongest man could barely stand. Others swore the first sign was the swelling of a tender spot beneath the skin, which would darken over days until it looked almost black. No matter how it started, the end was almost always the same. In the beginning, people tried to fit these reports into what they already knew. A fever could be explained by bad air or spoiled food. Swellings might come from an infection caused by an injury. Even the speed with which it spread could be rationalized. Perhaps the illness traveled only among those who lived in close quarters or shared the same well water. But as more merchants and sailors returned with similar accounts, the pattern became harder to ignore. In the coastal towns, the mood began to shift. Harbor masters, once eager for the arrival of ships bearing goods from distant ports, started to look at each incoming vessel with a mix of hope and apprehension. Goods meant trade, and trade meant income, but ships could also bring sickness. It was said that in some places, boats were left anchored in the harbor for days before anyone dared approach, waiting to see if illness would strike those aboard. The church bells, once rung only for the hours of the day and the call to worship, began to toll more frequently, not for the dead in their own towns, at least not yet, but for those remembered in prayer. Priests spoke from their pulpits about the need for repentance, warning that pestilence often followed sin. Some listeners nodded in agreement. Others whispered afterward that the sickness was no punishment from above, but rather something carried in the air or in the goods that traveled with merchants. Even so, life in most towns carried on much as before. Farmers brought their produce to market. Children played in the streets, their laughter chasing away the unease for a while. Shoemakers, blacksmiths, and tailors went about their work. But in the quieter moments, at the well in the early morning, by the hearth after dark, people spoke of the growing number of towns, far to the south and east, where the streets had fallen silent. By the spring of the following year, the rumors had grown sharper, more detailed. Now there were names to go with the places. Ports in Italy, cities in the east, islands where the sickness had appeared and then vanished, leaving behind only a fraction of the people who had once lived there. There were even tales of villages that had barred their gates entirely, refusing to let travelers enter for fear they might bring the affliction with them. A few officials in larger towns began to consider similar measures, though most hesitated. To cut off trade was to invite hunger. To bar the gates was to risk angering neighbors and allies. And besides, There was no proof that the illness would ever come this far. Yet beneath the surface of ordinary days, an unease took root. The sea that had once been a highway for goods and ideas now seemed a potential carrier of something unseen and unwelcome. By midsummer, the whispers had become part of daily life. They were not constant. People still laughed, worked, and celebrated, but they lingered like the faint scent of smoke after a fire. When a traveler entered a market wearing clothes of foreign cut or carrying goods from the south, eyes followed him. Was his face pale from illness, or simply from the heat of the road? Was his cough from dust, or something more dangerous? The first real sign that the sickness was closer than anyone had thought came not from a trader's tale, but from a ship that arrived in the night. Its crew did not call out to the harbor master, nor did the usual bustle of unloading begin. Instead, the vessel lay quiet at anchor until morning, when a small boat was sent to investigate. Those who climbed aboard later spoke of the stillness, of the way the air seemed heavy, and of the bodies lying in the shadows below deck. There were survivors, but few, and they were too weak to speak more than a handful of words. From that day, the whispers were no longer about a far-off danger. The illness had touched the same waters, breathed the same air. It was no longer a story, it was a presence, unseen but felt, like the first cool wind before a storm. And though life continued, something in its rhythm had shifted. The bells still rang, the market still opened, but beneath every familiar sound was the knowledge that change was on the horizon. The first ports to face the sickness did so without warning. Ships had always been symbols of connection, vessels of trade, of wealth, of communication between lands separated by water. A harbor that bustled with sails was a sign of prosperity, for it meant new goods, fresh stories, and wider opportunities. But in the year when the illness arrived, the sight of unfamiliar sails on the horizon began to carry a shadow with it. Dock workers, who had once hurried down to greet incoming ships, sometimes hesitated now. They watched from a distance as the vessel drew near, trying to judge from the movement on deck whether the crew was strong and lively or oddly subdued. In some cases, the silence of a ship was noticeable even before it had reached the quay. The normal calls between sailors, the songs, the shouted commands, all were missing. Instead, the vessel slid forward almost quietly, ropes being dropped with little energy, sails being lowered by hands that trembled with weakness. When the first men stepped onto the docks, they carried with them more than goods. Some were pale and unsteady, clutching their sides as though each breath weighed heavily upon them. Others bore marks upon their skin, swellings hidden beneath their garments but revealed in their weary movements. Their voices cracked when they tried to speak, and their eyes had the dull look of those already beyond the reach of healing. The townsfolk who witnessed this were torn. On the one hand, the cargo aboard the ships was valuable. Spices, cloth, oils, and grain were all needed, and merchants depended upon their sale. On the other hand, whispers had long warned of a sickness traveling with sailors. The decision was not easy. Should the goods be welcomed, or should the vessel be sent away? Sometimes a compromise was attempted. Crews were ordered to stay aboard, while their wares were unloaded separately. But the invisible nature of the affliction made such measures uncertain at best. Before long, illness began to appear among the dockworkers themselves. Men who had hauled crates in the morning were feverish by nightfall. Women who washed clothes for sailors found themselves struck by sudden chills. Children who had wandered near the quay, curious about the foreign ships, returned home with tired eyes and coughing fits. The disease, whatever it was, seemed to move not only through touch but also through the very air. The sound of bells changed in these towns. Where once they had rung for weddings, for festivals, and for the rhythm of the day, now they tolled more frequently for funerals. At first, the tolling was scattered, one in the morning, another in the afternoon. But within weeks, the sound became constant, a steady reminder of loss that echoed through the narrow streets. The townspeople began to dread the ringing, for it meant another neighbor, another friend, had been taken. Priests and friars walked through the streets, carrying incense and chanting prayers, believing that the smoke might purify the air. Some towns ordered fires to be lit in the squares, hoping the flames would drive away the unseen corruption. Herbs were hung in doorways and worn around the neck: rosemary, sage, and lavender chosen for their scents. People believed that if the air smelled sweet, it might ward off whatever poison was spreading. Despite these efforts, the illness did not slow. The crowded quarters of the ports made them especially vulnerable. Families lived close together, houses sharing walls and courtyards. When one person fell ill, it was often only a matter of days before their neighbors did as well. Markets, once lively with chatter and haggling, grew quieter. Merchants spread their goods more thinly, leaving space between stalls where before there had been none. Even so, the sickness passed easily from one to another. Some ships, upon seeing the fate of nearby harbors, tried to avoid docking altogether. They anchored offshore, flying signals of distress but unwilling to approach land. Sailors sickened on their decks, sometimes dying where they lay, while townsfolk watched from the shore, unsure whether to help or to hold back. To offer aid was to risk contagion. To refuse was to abandon fellow men to their fate. Neither choice sat easily upon those who had to make it. As the weeks passed, the sight of new sails became less a sign of promise and more a warning. Some towns even closed their harbors, refusing entry to foreign ships. Wooden barriers were raised, and guards were posted to keep travelers from entering. But such measures were imperfect. The illness had already taken root, and those within the walls carried it onward, to inns, to churches, and to the homes of their kin. The ports were the first to fall silent. Streets that once echoed with the shouts of sailors and the creak of wagons grew empty. The clatter of tools in the shipyards was replaced by the hush of shuttered windows. Dogs wandered without masters, sniffing at closed doors. Cats prowled the alleys, their eyes shining in the dim light, as if the city belonged more to them now than to the people. For those who lived inland, the reports of these harbors sounded almost unreal. It was hard to imagine that the busy ports, so essential to trade, so full of life, could be reduced to quiet in so short a time. Yet the travelers who passed through confirmed it. They spoke of streets where the grass had begun to grow between the stones, of markets abandoned, of churches filled with the sound of prayers for the dying. And with every such account, the realization grew stronger. What had begun at the edges of the sea was moving steadily inward, following the roads and rivers into the heart of the land. By the time the illness was firmly established in the ports, it was already too late to contain. Caravans carried goods to inland towns, and with the goods came the sickness. Messengers rode from one city to the next, bearing not only letters but also the invisible breath of contagion. Pilgrims traveling to shrines brought with them not just devotion, but also the early signs of fever. The ports were only the beginning. The rest of the world was waiting. The illness, when it came, was unlike the ordinary fevers and chills that people had long endured. Its course was swift, its effects visible, and its presence unmistakable once it entered a household. Those who lived through it, whether as sufferers, caretakers, or survivors, described it in ways that carried both fear and resignation. At first, it often seemed like little more than a common sickness. A person might complain of a sudden chill, the kind that made the skin prickle and the teeth chatter. Sometimes it was accompanied by a sharp headache or a deep ache in the limbs. Families thought little of it at first, for such complaints were ordinary enough. Many people lived with aches and fevers throughout the year, caused by damp weather, poor diet, or the smoke of the hearth. But in this case, the illness advanced with unusual speed. Within a single day, the person might be unable to rise from bed. Their skin grew hot to the touch, the chill replaced by a burning fever that flushed their cheeks and left sweat soaking through their clothes. Their eyes grew heavy and clouded, and their breathing came in short, labored bursts. The household, once calm, filled with the sound of restless movement. The patient tossing upon the bed, muttering words that made little sense, their mind already slipping into fevered confusion. Not long after, the most dreaded sign appeared, swellings beneath the skin. These lumps, known to people as buboes, rose most often in the armpits, the groin, or the neck, places where the body's heat gathered. At first they were the size of a small nut, tender but not unbearable. Within hours, however, they grew larger, swelling to the size of an apple or even more, pressing against the skin until the flesh darkened with a deep, bruised color. The pain was sharp, enough to bring cries even from the strongest men, enough to keep children restless and moaning through the night. As the swellings worsened, so too did the other symptoms. The fever climbed higher, leaving the patient drenched and trembling, caught between shivering chills and burning heat. The body seemed unable to decide whether it froze or burned. Some developed black or purple marks upon the skin, blotches that spread across the arms, legs, and face. These dark stains appeared suddenly, sometimes within a single night, as though the blood itself had turned against the body. The breath of the afflicted grew foul, their speech broken, their minds wandering. Some spoke to those who were not there, calling out to loved ones long dead. Others fell into silence, staring at the ceiling with unblinking eyes. A few clung fiercely to wakefulness, begging their families for water, for air, for prayers. But the illness gave little reprieve. Death often came swiftly. In many cases, it arrived within 3 or 4 days of the first symptoms. Some did not even last that long. It was rare for anyone who showed the swellings to recover, though there were occasional tales of survivors, individuals who lived for weeks with the buboes and, against all expectation, saw them shrink and fade. These rare recoveries gave hope to some, but to most families, the appearance of the swelling was as good as a death sentence. The spread of the illness was as terrifying as its symptoms. In the close quarters of a household, once one member sickened, others soon followed. A father might fall ill on a Monday, the mother by Wednesday, and the children by the end of the week. Entire families could be struck down before any outside help arrived. In villages, neighbors came to comfort and to pray, only to return to their own homes carrying the same hidden danger. Within days, one household's misfortune became the misfortune of the whole street. In towns and cities, where people lived even closer together, the pace of spread was faster still. Markets, churches, and wells, all the places where daily life drew people together, became points of risk. A simple greeting, a shared loaf, or even the nearness of another's breath could be enough to pass on the sickness. And because no one could see the cause, every interaction carried with it an unseen fear. Some households tried to protect themselves by shutting their doors, refusing entry even to neighbors and kin. Food was passed through windows rather than shared indoors. Those with means sometimes fled the towns altogether, seeking refuge in the countryside, where they hoped the air would be cleaner, the space wider, and the risk less. Yet even in the quiet of the fields, the illness sometimes followed, carried by travelers, by servants, or even by the wind, as people believed. Fear of the unseen made life itself uneasy. A cough in the night could make a household sit upright in dread. A sudden faintness at the well could scatter those nearby. Even the healthy looked upon each other with suspicion, for no one knew who might already be carrying the unseen poison within them. Priests and doctors alike searched for explanations. Some believed the sickness was carried by the air itself, a corruption of the atmosphere that could be breathed in. Others thought it traveled through touch, passing from clothing to skin. A few whispered of God's wrath, a punishment upon the world for its sins, though such explanations brought little comfort to those who saw both the virtuous and the sinful struck down alike. The sight of the afflicted left deep impressions on those who survived. The swelling, the blotches, the cries of pain, and the sudden silence that followed were not easily forgotten. Entire neighborhoods carried the memory of days when carts rolled slowly down the streets, collecting the bodies of those who had fallen, the air heavy with the sound of bells and the chanting of prayers. By the time the sickness had passed through its first households in any town, the community was no longer the same. Families were broken, houses stood empty, and the rhythm of daily life had shifted. Where once there had been noise and movement, there was quiet and hesitation. And always, at the edges of thought, was the fear of who would be next. The illness did not merely strike the body, it struck the fabric of society itself. It spread with speed, with certainty, and with a force that seemed beyond human control. And as it moved from house to house, street to street, village to town, it carried with it not only death, but also the heavy weight of dread, the knowledge that no place was truly safe and no life entirely secure. When the sickness had revealed itself in its most visible forms, fever, swelling, and sudden death, people naturally sought to understand why it had come. For centuries, humankind had turned to patterns, signs, and explanations when disaster struck. A failed harvest might be blamed on the weather, on poor soil, or on the displeasure of God. A sudden fire might be seen as chance, or as punishment, or as a test of endurance. In the same way, the Black Death demanded reasons, and men and women of the time searched tirelessly for them. The most immediate explanation was spiritual. For much of medieval Europe, religion shaped daily life more deeply than anything else. The rhythm of the bells, the calendar of the saints, the teachings of priests, all provided order and meaning. When disaster appeared on such a scale, it was natural to believe it must be part of God's design. Many said openly that the pestilence was punishment for sin. Humanity had grown prideful, greedy, and cruel, and now the Creator sent this great scourge as correction. In towns and villages, sermons echoed this belief. Priests called upon their congregations to repent, to confess, to abandon their vices, and to beg for forgiveness. People flocked to churches, kneeling in large numbers, filling the air with prayers for mercy. Some walked barefoot through the streets in solemn processions, carrying candles and chanting hymns. The tolling of bells accompanied their voices, blending grief with devotion. For a time, many believed that if they humbled themselves enough, the sickness might be lifted. Yet, as the weeks stretched into months, the illness showed no sign of easing. Even the most faithful fell ill, and even the most penitent were carried away. This raised troubling questions. If it was God's punishment, why did the innocent perish alongside the guilty? Why did priests, monks, and nuns, those who had given their lives in service, fall in such numbers? These doubts did not erase faith, but they complicated it, and people looked for other answers to stand alongside the spiritual ones. Physicians, too, sought explanations, though the science of their day was limited. Medicine in the 14th century drew heavily upon ancient sources, particularly the writings of Galen and Hippocrates, men who had lived centuries before. Their theories, especially the idea of the four humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, were still central. Health, according to these beliefs, depended on the balance of these humors, and sickness arose when they fell into disorder. To the physicians of the age, the sudden fevers and swellings might be signs of corrupted humors. They believed the body was overwhelmed by excess, its fluids spoiled by unseen causes. Treatment, then, often meant trying to restore balance. Bleeding was one common method, cutting the patient to let blood flow, with the hope that the bad humors would leave the body. Another was purging, using strong herbs to drive sickness out through the stomach or bowels. Cupping, leeching, and sweating were all employed in attempts to force the illness away. But even as they tried these measures, many physicians admitted the results were poor. Patients continued to die in great numbers, no matter how carefully the treatments were applied. In desperation, some began to study the skies. Astrology, widely respected at the time, suggested that the positions of the planets and stars could influence human health. A widely circulated belief held that a rare conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in the year 1345 had corrupted the air of the Earth, filling it with deadly vapors. These vapors, it was said, caused the plague. The idea of bad air, or miasma, gained strong ground. People believed that the air itself had turned poisonous, and that breathing it carried death. To guard against this, many wore herbs and spices around their necks, rosemary, sage, and thyme, or more exotic goods like cloves and cinnamon, if they could afford them. Some carried small balls of resin or pressed flowers to hold beneath their noses, so that sweet scents would filter out the corruption. Doctors wore long robes and, later, masks with pointed beaks stuffed with herbs, designed to cleanse the air they breathed. Fires, too, were thought to cleanse the air. In many towns, great bonfires were lit in the squares, and people gathered around them, believing the flames would drive away the poison vapors. In some places, barrels of aromatic woods were burned, juniper, pine, or frankincense, so that the smoke might act as a shield. The smell of burning filled the streets, mingling with the cries of the sick and the tolling of bells. Not all explanations were so abstract. Some sought someone to blame. Rumors spread that certain groups, foreigners, strangers, or even local minorities, were poisoning wells or food. In some towns, this led to violence as fear turned neighbors against one another. Though authorities sometimes tried to calm such suspicions, the panic was difficult to contain, and the grief of the afflicted often sought a human cause. Others turned inward, blaming themselves not only for sins of faith but for faults of daily life. People swore off laughter, music, or fine clothing, believing joy itself might have brought on divine wrath. Some took to the roads as penitents, whipping their backs in long processions, hoping their suffering might lessen the greater suffering around them. These flagellants, as they were called, traveled from town to town, chanting, bleeding, and praying in public. To many they seemed holy. To others, they seemed only to spread fear further. In every explanation, one theme remained constant: the desire to make sense of the incomprehensible. Whether through religion, medicine, astrology, or rumor, people searched for patterns that might explain why so many fell and why some survived while others did not. The effort was not only intellectual but deeply human. To live in a world where death came suddenly and without warning was unbearable unless it could be named, described, and given reason. Yet the truth, as later centuries would uncover, was not in the stars, nor in the air, nor even in the failings of the soul. It was in the smallest of creatures, unseen by any in that age, carried quietly by the fleas of rats that roamed the ships and streets. But this knowledge lay far beyond the reach of 14th century men and women. For them, the plague remained a mystery, an invisible enemy explained by prayers, by herbs, by stars, by fire, and by fear. And so the world continued, seeking not only to endure the sickness, but to understand it, even if those understandings were fragile, imperfect, and unable to stop the tolling of the bells that marked each passing day. Daily life during the plague did not stop altogether, though it changed in ways that those who survived would never forget. People still needed bread to eat, water to drink, and roofs above their heads. Livestock still needed tending, fires still needed kindling, and children still cried for comfort. Yet every ordinary task was colored by the shadow of sickness, and each simple action carried with it new risks, new fears, and new meanings. In many villages, the rhythm of work slowed. Fields that once rang with the sound of sickles fell silent, their crops left to stand too long in the sun. In some cases, whole families perished, leaving no one to bring in the harvest. Neighbors, already burdened with their own troubles, could not always spare the labor to help. The result was waste, ears of wheat shriveling, apples rotting on their branches, grapes left unpicked on the vine. The land continued to give, but there were fewer hands to gather its gifts. In towns, the streets were quieter than before. Merchants' stalls stood half empty, their goods spoiled or unsold. Blacksmiths, cobblers, and weavers found fewer customers, for many had neither the coin nor the spirit to purchase anything beyond what was necessary. Markets were no longer the bustling centers of chatter and barter. They became tense spaces where people moved quickly, avoiding close contact when they could, each glance tinged with suspicion. The home itself became both refuge and prison. Families shuttered their doors, sealing themselves away from neighbors, sometimes for weeks at a time. Meals were eaten with care, food stretched to last longer, for visits to the market carried risk. Bread grew harder, meat scarcer, and soups thinner. In wealthier houses, servants were sent to fetch supplies, but even servants fell ill, and no amount of silver guaranteed safety. Children, usually quick to laughter, grew quieter during those months and years. They were told not to play in the streets, not to run with friends, not to touch strangers. Many obeyed, though some could not resist the pull of curiosity, peering through cracks in the shutters or sneaking out to chase one another when the air seemed calm. Yet even play was hushed, for the sound of bells and the sight of funerals had become part of their daily world. Care for the sick fell to family members, for there were rarely enough physicians to go around. Mothers tended to children with fevers, husbands bathed wives who shivered and sweated, daughters sat beside fathers who moaned in restless sleep. In many cases, these acts of care brought the sickness into the caretakers themselves. A son who held his mother's hand one evening might himself be carried to bed by morning. Still, such duties were performed, often in silence, for to abandon the sick was seen by many as cruel, even if fear whispered otherwise. There were, however, those who did flee from the afflicted. Some households barred their doors against relatives who came seeking shelter. Neighbors refused to share food or water with those whose families were ill. In wealthier quarters, the rich sometimes escaped to country estates, leaving behind the crowded streets of the town. The countryside, though safer for a time, was not free from danger, and often the plague followed them there. Yet the impulse to run, to hide, to protect one's own, was strong. Religious life also changed in its daily rhythms. Churches remained places of gathering, though with greater caution. Prayers were said in whispers, processions wound slowly through streets, and candles burned constantly before the altars. Priests heard confessions at all hours, sometimes so many in a day that their voices grew hoarse. Monasteries and convents, too, were altered, as some were nearly emptied by illness while others took in orphans or travelers seeking shelter. The sight of monks moving through the streets, chanting or carrying the dead, became part of ordinary life. In many towns, carts rolled daily to collect bodies. The creak of wheels and the calls of the drivers were sounds people came to know, as well as the crowing of the rooster or the ringing of the town bell. Those who drove the carts were often rough men, paid to do what few others could bear. They called through the streets for families to bring out their dead, and sometimes they entered houses themselves, carrying out those who had been left behind. To live in such a place meant that one's sleep might be broken not by laughter or song, but by the heavy thud of a body placed upon a cart. For those still unstricken, survival became not only a matter of avoiding illness but of managing the loneliness, the grief, and the constant reminders of mortality. Some turned to books, if they had them, or to music played quietly in the safety of their homes. Others sought distraction in small tasks, mending clothes, grinding grain, weaving baskets, chores that kept the hands busy while the mind wandered. Stories and tales were told to pass the time, especially among children. Legends of saints, fables of clever animals, or even memories of festivals past were shared around hearths, offering brief escape from the heaviness outside. These stories were often spoken softly, the voices low, as though even words themselves might carry danger if spoken too loudly. In rural areas, life retained more of its old rhythms, though still under strain. Farmers rose to tend their animals, milk their cows, or cut wood for winter. Yet even in the countryside, the sight of abandoned cottages was not uncommon. A family might be struck down all at once, leaving their house empty, their fields untended, their tools rusting where they had been left. Travelers sometimes found these places eerily silent, as though time itself had paused within their walls. The presence of death altered celebrations and milestones. Weddings were fewer, and when they did take place, they were smaller, quieter affairs. Births still occurred, though midwives carried heavy burdens, for many mothers and infants did not survive. Feasts and festivals, once the joy of the community, were cancelled or stripped down to simple gatherings. Joy itself became muted, as though people feared to tempt fate by showing too much happiness in such a time. Yet, despite the shadow of death, small acts of kindness persisted. Neighbors shared bread when they could spare it, or left baskets of apples at one another's doors. Priests sat beside the dying, whispering prayers even at the risk of catching the illness themselves. Mothers sang softly to children with fevers, their voices steady even when their hearts trembled. Such moments of care and compassion gave shape to daily life, reminding those who endured that even in darkness, bonds of family and community did not fully break. Living under the plague meant carrying grief alongside necessity. It meant tending to animals while wondering whether tomorrow would bring fever. It meant baking bread while hearing the sound of carts outside. It meant watching the sun rise and set with gratitude for one more day of health, even as the shadow of sickness stretched across every horizon. For some, the weight of such a life became unbearable. They abandoned their towns, their families, or even their faith. For others, endurance became its own form of courage, the simple act of rising each morning, lighting the fire, and carrying on the tasks of survival, no matter how heavy the silence, no matter how uncertain the future. And so, day by day, month by month, life under the plague was not only a tale of sickness and death, but of persistence. It was the story of ordinary people, farmers, bakers, children, and priests, who carried forward the work of living even while surrounded by loss. In their quiet acts, their small meals, their whispered prayers, they sustained the fragile thread of human life, weaving a tapestry of endurance that stretched across those terrible years. Death during the plague years was not a sudden visitor, but a constant presence. It lingered in the air, hung in the silence of the streets, and echoed in the tolling of bells. People lived with it as one might live with the weather, unable to control it, forced to endure it, shaping their routines around its patterns. And as the number of the dead grew, the ways in which people treated death, burial, and mourning changed in profound and often sorrowful ways. In earlier times, before the plague, funerals were occasions of ritual and community. The dead were washed, dressed in clean clothes, and laid out for family and neighbors to pay their respects. Candles were lit, prayers spoken, and the church bell rang solemnly to mark the passage of a soul. Burial took place in consecrated ground, often beside the church itself, where generations of families were laid together. It was a process that carried dignity, and it gave the living a chance to remember, to weep, and to seek comfort. But as the plague spread and the numbers of the dead rose, these customs became impossible to maintain. At first, priests and gravediggers tried to keep pace with tradition. Bodies were carried into churches, laid before altars, and given blessings. Yet soon the sheer weight of death overwhelmed them. One priest could not perform 100 funerals in a week. One small cemetery could not hold the bodies of an entire town. The rituals began to shrink and then to vanish. Families, overwhelmed by fear of contagion, often hurried burials or avoided them altogether. In some places, corpses were left outside houses, waiting for the death carts that passed daily. Men employed for the grim task would walk the streets, calling out in heavy voices for people to bring forth their dead. Those who could bear the sorrow lifted their loved ones to the cart. Others left the task to the collectors, who entered houses themselves to gather what remained. The carts themselves became symbols of the time, wooden, simple, drawn by horses or mules, their wheels creaking as they rolled through silent lanes. Sometimes a driver sang or called out to steady his courage, but more often there was only silence, broken by the thud of bodies being lifted. Those who watched from their windows saw scenes they would never forget. Children wrapped in blankets, old men carried out on wooden boards, women laid down with rosaries still tangled in their hands. With cemeteries overflowing, new burial grounds had to be created. Fields outside towns were turned into makeshift graveyards. In many places, great pits were dug, wide and deep, into which dozens, sometimes hundreds of bodies were lowered. Priests stood at the edge of these pits, raising their hands in blessing, though often unable to give each person the rites once considered essential. Candles and incense, once symbols of reverence, were scarce, and the smoke of earth replaced them. The image of mass graves became one of the defining memories of the plague. Bodies were layered with earth and lime, sometimes covered quickly to keep the air clear, sometimes left longer than anyone wished because there were too few to dig. To see such a pit was to know the scale of loss in a way words could not convey. Survivors spoke of the silence that fell around them, as though the earth itself carried the weight of grief. Not all burials were alike, however. The wealthy often sought private plots, hiring men to dig deeper graves in secluded corners, hoping to protect their families from the common pit. Nobles and rulers sometimes demanded mausoleums or sealed tombs, though even these did not always protect against the creeping decay of time. For the poor, there was no choice but the communal grave. Rich or poor, however, the earth eventually gathered all alike. Mourning itself changed under such circumstances. Where once families gathered openly to weep, to sing, or to tell stories of the dead, now grief was quieter, more private. People wept behind closed doors, for gatherings were dangerous, and there were too many losses to bear publicly. Black clothes were worn less often, not because sorrow lessened, but because grief became constant, and the customs of mourning blurred into everyday life. The church bells, which had always marked death with dignity, rang so often that their sound became part of the background of daily living. In some towns, the bells tolled every hour, each peal another reminder of mortality. People came to dread the sound even as they depended on it, for the ringing told them how many neighbors, friends, or relatives had gone that day. Children grew up in a world where the sight of funerals was ordinary. They learned to walk past carts without staring, to avoid burial pits, to lower their voices when the bells began. For them, death was not an interruption of life but a part of it, woven into the very fabric of their days. In monasteries and convents, the toll was especially heavy. Communities of monks and nuns often died together, their shared lives ending in shared silence. Those who remained carried the duty of burying their brothers or sisters, sometimes digging graves with their own weakened hands. The songs of prayer that once echoed through cloisters grew fewer, their voices thinned by loss. Yet still they sang, believing that even the simplest hymn could carry souls heavenward. And yet, in the midst of this heavy shadow, there were moments of resilience. Families found ways to remember their loved ones without the full rites. Some carved simple marks on wooden boards, placing them at the edge of fields to remember where their kin lay. Others whispered the names of the dead in their prayers each night, keeping memory alive in the rhythm of speech. A handful of communities wrote lists of the departed, so that even if graves were lost, the names would remain. The scale of mourning was so vast that it reshaped entire societies. Generations were thinned. Families were cut in half. Guilds and councils found their numbers decimated. To mourn one person was to mourn many, and yet, somehow, life continued. People rose each day to dig, to cook, to tend animals, to pray, even while sorrow walked beside them. Thus, the burial practices of the Black Death were not only about laying bodies to rest, but about the endurance of those who survived. They spoke of a people forced to let go of old traditions, yet still striving to give meaning to loss. The graves, whether marked or unmarked, individual or shared, became the silent witnesses of a time when death seemed to rule the earth. And in those graves lay not only the bodies of millions, but also the stories, the songs, and the memories of an age that had been forever altered. In the countryside, far from the bustle of cities and the crowded markets of towns, people had once believed themselves safer. Villages were smaller, families more spread out, and the rhythms of life slower, tied to the fields and the seasons. Yet when the plague reached the countryside, its effects were just as devastating, and in some ways even more enduring. At first, rural communities often heard only rumors. News traveled along the roads, carried by merchants, travelers, or wandering clerics. A villager might hear that a distant town had lost hundreds in a single week, or that in another province, entire parishes lay abandoned. The stories seemed distant, almost unreal, until the sickness appeared in their own fields and farmsteads. Then, the fear became immediate and personal. When the plague struck villages, it often moved from household to household with the same cruel swiftness seen in the towns. A farmer, who one day labored in the fields, might the next be confined to bed, trembling with fever. His wife, his children, and his servants followed soon after. A single farmhouse could be emptied within days. In places where families lived close together, neighbors came to help with chores, to fetch water, or to tend to the sick, and by so doing, they carried the illness home with them. The result was a countryside scattered with silence. Whole villages lost much of their population. Some communities were reduced to only a handful of survivors. There are accounts of hamlets where the fields lay untended, the cattle wandering freely, and the houses empty but for the belongings left behind. Weeds grew up through paths once well-trodden, and the sound of the mill wheel or the blacksmith's hammer grew rare. Agriculture, the backbone of medieval life, suffered deeply. With so many laborers lost, fields went untilled, crops unharvested, and herds untended. Wheat, barley, oats, and rye, all essential for bread and daily meals, stood rotting in the fields. Fruit trees dropped their harvests untaken. Sheep, cows, and goats often strayed unattended, their bleating echoing in empty pastures. For those who survived, food shortages soon became as pressing as the fear of illness itself. And yet, strangely, famine did not always follow as quickly as might be expected. For while the loss of labor meant fewer hands to work the land, it also meant fewer mouths to feed. Villages that once struggled to divide grain among many suddenly had more than enough for those who remained. But the balance was uneven. Some places found themselves with surpluses, while others, where survivors were too few to reap what had been sown, faced hunger despite plenty lying all around them. The structure of rural life also changed. Manors, once bustling with peasants who tilled the lord's fields, often stood half empty. Lords found their lands producing less, their rents unpaid, their tenants gone. Entire villages were sometimes abandoned, their houses falling into ruin, their fields reclaimed by the wild. In some regions, maps of the countryside had to be redrawn, for the communities that had existed before the plague no longer existed after. Those who survived often found themselves with new opportunities. A peasant who once struggled to earn a living wage might suddenly find his labor in high demand. With fewer workers available, landowners competed for hands to till the fields, offering better pay, lighter duties, or even the chance to farm land outright. For the first time in generations, many peasants could bargain for their work, shifting the balance of power in small but important ways. But such changes did not come without resistance. Lords and rulers, seeing their authority threatened by the rising demands of laborers, tried to impose limits. Laws were passed in many kingdoms to fix wages, to forbid peasants from leaving their villages, and to restore the old order. Yet the scarcity of workers meant that enforcement was difficult. Quietly, often without open conflict, the old system of feudal obligations began to weaken, replaced by something more fluid, shaped by necessity rather than tradition. The countryside also carried the heavy burden of grief. Small villages were close-knit, with families bound together by ties of kinship and neighborly care. To lose half of a village was not merely a matter of numbers. It meant the loss of familiar voices, the silence of gatherings, the absence of friends and relatives who had been part of daily life since birth. The mourning was communal, yet often quiet, as survivors struggled to rebuild routines while carrying the weight of loss. Religious practices in villages reflected this grief. Chapels and small churches, once filled with music and prayer, often stood empty or were attended by only a few. Priests themselves were not spared by the plague, and many parishes found themselves without spiritual guidance. Those who remained did their best, moving between scattered households, blessing fields, and offering comfort, though often overwhelmed by the magnitude of suffering. The land itself bore witness to the changes. Abandoned farms fell into ruin, their fences broken, their roofs collapsing. Wild animals crept closer to villages, reclaiming spaces once kept firmly under human watch. In some places, forests spread into fields that had once been cultivated, a slow but visible reminder of how quickly human presence could fade. Yet not all was decline. For some survivors, the countryside after the plague offered a strange abundance. With fewer people, there was more land available, more animals to herd, more houses to occupy. Some families moved into larger homes, claiming space once held by neighbors. Others expanded their herds or fields, finding themselves wealthier in land and goods than they could ever have imagined before. It was a bitter wealth, purchased at the cost of so many lives, but it shaped the future nonetheless. Thus, the villages of Europe were reshaped not only by loss but by transformation. The Black Death emptied houses, silenced fields, and brought grief into every family. Yet it also unsettled the old order, broke apart rigid systems of labor, and left survivors with both burdens and opportunities. The quiet lanes of the countryside, the abandoned farms, the half-empty villages, all stood as reminders of a time when death walked the land, but also of the resilience of those who remained, who planted again, who rebuilt, and who carried forward the memory of what had been lost. The towns and cities of Europe had always been centers of energy and movement. Markets filled with voices, guild halls alive with the business of craftsmen, narrow streets echoing with the clatter of carts, and churches resounding with bells. Life in the city was dense and constant, every corner filled with sound, color, and the press of people. Yet when the Black Death arrived, the rhythm of urban life faltered, and the very things that had once given cities their vibrancy became sources of peril and loss. In the earliest stages, city dwellers noticed the plague in whispers and rumors. A neighbor fell ill and died within days. A merchant closed his shop, his family gone in silence. Bells rang more often, carts passed more frequently, and the markets grew less crowded. At first, some thought it a temporary illness, like others that had swept through before. But as the numbers grew, denial gave way to fear, and fear became part of the daily life of the city. The closeness of city living made contagion swift. Families shared small, crowded houses. Narrow streets kept people in near constant contact. Water sources and marketplaces drew together all who lived nearby. A sickness that might move slowly in the countryside moved rapidly here, sweeping through entire districts in days. Whole neighborhoods grew quiet as families succumbed, doors closed, shutters drawn. Streets that had been filled with laughter, trade, and argument became silent, broken only by the passing of death carts and the toll of bells. Trade, the lifeblood of towns, withered. Merchants closed their shops for fear of infection. Stalls once filled with cloth, spices, or pottery stood empty. Ships and harbors remained anchored, their sails furled, either because sailors had died or because towns refused to let them dock. Caravans slowed, then stopped altogether, as roads grew dangerous and inns emptied. Without trade, money grew scarce, and guilds that had flourished for generations suddenly faced collapse. Guilds, once proud institutions of urban life, were especially hard hit. The shoemakers, the bakers, the weavers, the smiths, each guild found its members thinning rapidly. Apprenticeships were interrupted, masters died before they could pass on their knowledge, and families that had relied on craft for generations found themselves without successors. In some cases, trades nearly disappeared in certain towns, only slowly rebuilt by survivors who had to relearn skills once common. Markets, which had always been centers of life, took on an eerie emptiness. Where once farmers from the countryside brought produce, they now feared the contagion of the city. Where once townsfolk gathered in crowds to buy bread, meat, or fish, only small groups came, quickly exchanging coins and leaving. The cries of sellers, once a daily chorus, grew faint. In some cities, marketplaces stood nearly deserted, the stalls abandoned, the ground strewn with dust rather than goods. Public spaces, too, felt the change. Fountains that once supplied water became places of fear, for many believed contagion spread through the very air or through shared touch. Bathhouses, common in towns, were shuttered, their waters left still. Taverns and inns, once lively with travelers' tales and the laughter of companions, were hushed or closed entirely. The hum of collective life diminished until the city seemed like a shell of itself. Religious life in cities changed dramatically as well. Cathedrals and parish churches, once crowded with worshippers, grew strangely empty. Many feared gathering in large groups, believing it brought danger. Priests and monks who continued their duties often found themselves overwhelmed, performing funerals in endless succession, their voices weary, their robes worn. Some churches rang their bells constantly, their towers echoing with a sound that seemed endless, a reminder of death rather than celebration of life. The urban poor were often the hardest hit. Their houses were cramped, their food supplies uncertain, and their health already fragile from years of labor. For them, the plague struck swiftly and cruelly. Entire tenements emptied. Beggars disappeared from streets where once they had been constant figures. The city's poorest quarters often saw the heaviest toll, their narrow alleys filled with silence and sorrow. Yet the wealthy, too, could not escape. Though some fled to country estates, carrying with them supplies and servants, not all reached safety. Servants fell ill and carried sickness with them. Lords and merchants who stayed behind found their households no more secure than the cottages of the poor. The plague moved without regard for wealth, and in its path, all stood vulnerable. With so many gone, the structures of governance faltered. Councils lost members. Records went unkept. Taxes could not be collected. Guards, clerks, and messengers died in equal measure, leaving cities without the means to maintain their usual order. The machinery of urban rule slowed and, in some cases, nearly stopped. Survivors did what they could, but authority was weakened, sometimes leaving cities nearly leaderless in their darkest hours. The absence of people reshaped the very sound and sight of cities. Streets once bustling with activity were quiet enough that the call of a crow could be heard clearly. Empty windows stared down from houses once full of families. Dogs wandered without masters, and cats slipped through deserted alleys. Grass sprouted between cobblestones, and in some places, vines climbed walls where no hands were left to tend them. And yet, amid decline, seeds of change were planted. Just as in the countryside, the scarcity of people created opportunities. Survivors found houses abandoned, shops vacant, positions open. Where once competition for space and work had been fierce, now there was room to move, to claim, to begin anew. Laborers could demand better wages. Craftsmen could rise to prominence more quickly. Families could take possession of homes or lands they had never imagined owning. Over time, as the first great waves of the plague passed, cities began to adjust. Slowly, markets reopened, though with fewer stalls. Guilds sought new apprentices to rebuild their ranks. Councils gathered again, though with empty chairs where leaders had once sat. Life resumed, altered but not destroyed. The memory of loss remained, but alongside it came a sense of resilience, of survival, of carrying forward in a changed world. The plague had carved deep scars into the cities of Europe. It had silenced their streets, emptied their houses, and broken their routines. But it also reshaped them, forcing changes in labor, trade, and community. The cities that rose from the shadow of the Black Death were not the same as those that had stood before. They bore the memory of emptiness, yet also the strength of endurance, carried by the survivors who walked their streets once more.